The morning sun shone brightly through the windows of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport as the Johnson family made their way through the bustling terminal. Robert Johnson, a 45-year-old man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, walked beside his wife, Dr. Patricia Johnson, who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years saving lives in operating rooms. Their two children, 16-year-old Lisa and 12-year-old Kevin, chattered excitedly about their upcoming trip to Los Angeles. Today was special. Lisa had just received her acceptance letter to one of the country's most prestigious universities, and the family was flying out to attend her orientation weekend. Robert had worked incredibly hard to build his technology company from nothing, and now, 20 years later, he wanted to celebrate this milestone with his family in style. He had purchased first-class tickets for all four of them, something he rarely did despite his success. As they approached Gate 23 for Meridian Airways Flight 447, Kevin bounced on his toes with excitement. This was only his second time flying, and he couldn't stop talking about sitting in the big leather seats he had seen in movies. Lisa, trying to act more mature, rolled her eyes at her little brother but secretly shared his enthusiasm. She had been dreaming of this moment for months. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers calling for first-class passengers to board first. Robert gathered their carry-on bags while Patricia double-checked their boarding passes one more time. The family joined the short line of first-class passengers, their tickets clearly marked with seat numbers 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, as they handed their boarding passes to the gate agent. A friendly young man smiled and wished Lisa good luck at university. The family walked down the jet bridge, their spirits high and their hearts full of anticipation for the weekend ahead. Once on the plane, they found their seats in the second row of the first-class cabin. The seats were everything Kevin had imagined, wide, comfortable, and covered in soft leather. He immediately started exploring all the buttons and compartments, while Lisa pulled out her phone to take a selfie with her acceptance letter. Robert helped Patricia store their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment, and they settled into their seats. Other first-class passengers continued boarding around them, business travelers, an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, and a family with a young baby. The atmosphere was relaxed and pleasant. That's when Carol Williams appeared. Carol was a 15-year veteran flight attendant with Meridian Airways. At 38 years old, she had seen it all during her career, or so she thought. She prided herself on maintaining order in her cabin and ensuring that every passenger knew their place. As she walked through first class, checking passenger boarding passes and offering welcome drinks, her eyes fell on the Johnson family. Something didn't sit right with her. She had been working this route for years, and she knew the typical first-class passenger. These people just didn't fit her mental picture. She watched as Kevin excitedly pressed buttons on his armrest and as Lisa took photos with her phone. Their joy and enthusiasm somehow irritated her. Carol approached their row with a forced smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made Robert look up from his magazine. "I need to see your boarding passes again." Robert looked puzzled but reached into his jacket pocket. "Of course," he said politely, handing over all four boarding passes. "Is there a problem?" Carol examined the passes with exaggerated scrutiny, turning them over and holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. Other passengers in nearby seats began to notice the commotion. The boarding passes were clearly legitimate, printed on official Meridian Airways paper with proper barcodes and seat assignments. "These seats are for first-class passengers," Carol said, her tone implying that the family didn't belong there. Patricia looked up from her book, her eyebrows raised in confusion. "Yes, we know. That's what we paid for." Carol's expression hardened. She had expected them to back down, to apologize and move to economy class. Instead, they seemed confident in their right to be there. This only made her more suspicious. "I'm going to need to verify these with the gate agent," Carol announced loudly, causing more passengers to turn and stare. She made a show of walking to the front of the plane and picking up the phone. Kevin, who had been so excited moments before, now looked worried. "Dad, are we in trouble?" he whispered. Robert put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "No, buddy. There's just been some kind of misunderstanding. Everything will be fine." But everything was not fine. Carol returned from her phone call with an even more determined expression. She had spoken to the gate agent, who confirmed that the boarding passes were valid and the seats were properly assigned. This information, however, only seemed to fuel Carol's suspicion rather than resolve it. "The gate agent says your tickets are valid," Carol announced, as if this was somehow surprising news. "But I need to make sure you understand the expectations for first-class passengers." The insult hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Patricia felt her face grow warm with embarrassment and anger, but she maintained her composure. As a surgeon, she was used to handling high-stress situations with grace. "We understand perfectly well how to behave on an airplane," Patricia said calmly. "We fly frequently." This response seemed to annoy Carol even more. She began to pace back and forth in the aisle, her voice growing louder with each word. "I don't appreciate attitude from passengers. I'm responsible for the safety and comfort of everyone on this aircraft." Lisa looked down at her acceptance letter, suddenly feeling less proud and more ashamed. She wondered if this was what college would be like, people questioning whether she belonged in places she had earned the right to be. Kevin moved closer to his mother, sensing the tension even if he didn't fully understand it. Robert tried to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're just a family going to Los Angeles for our daughter's university orientation. We're not looking for any trouble." But Carol had already made up her mind. In her 15 years of flying, she had developed what she believed was a sixth sense about problematic passengers. She convinced herself that this family would cause issues during the flight, that their children would be too loud, that they would make unreasonable demands, that they would somehow disrupt the peaceful first-class environment she worked so hard to maintain. "I can see that your children are already being disruptive," Carol declared, pointing at Kevin, who was now sitting quietly next to his mother. "And I won't tolerate that kind of behavior in first class." The accusation was so unfair and baseless that several other passengers began to murmur among themselves. The elderly couple in row 1 exchanged concerned glances. A businessman across the aisle shook his head in disgust at Carol's treatment of the family. Patricia's medical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but she was struggling to contain her anger. "Our children are behaving perfectly." Well, Kevin was simply excited about his first time in first class. Excited passengers can quickly become disruptive passengers, Carol shot back. "I've seen it too many times before." Lisa finally spoke up, her voice small but determined. "We're not being disruptive. We're just happy about going to university." "Orientation." Carol turned her attention to the teenager, her expression growing even more stern. "Young lady, I don't need children telling me how to do my job. Your attitude is exactly what I'm talking about." The situation was spiraling out of control, and other passengers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Some began taking out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Robert realized that no amount of reasoning was going to change Carol's mind. "I'd like to speak with the captain," Robert said firmly but politely. Carol's eyes flashed with anger. "The captain is busy preparing for takeoff. I am the authority in this cabin, and I'm telling you that your family's behavior is unacceptable." What had started as a routine boarding process had transformed into a nightmare. The Johnson family found themselves trapped in a situation that seemed to be escalating beyond all reason, with no clear way to resolve it peacefully. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. Carol stood in the aisle with her hands on her hips, her face flushed with determination. She had convinced herself that she was protecting the other passengers from what she saw as a problematic situation. In her mind, she was doing her job perfectly. "I'm calling security," Carol announced loudly, making sure everyone in the cabin could hear her. "This family is being uncooperative and creating a disturbance." Robert felt his heart sink. He looked around at the other passengers, hoping someone would speak up and confirm that his family had done nothing wrong. A few people looked sympathetic, but most just stared in uncomfortable silence. The businessman across the aisle started recording with his phone, sensing that he was witnessing something important. "Please, there's no need for security," Robert said. his voice still calm despite the growing panic in his chest. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just trying to get to our seats." But Carol had already picked up the phone and was speaking to someone at the gate. "Yes, I need security at gate 23. I have a family in first class that's refusing to follow crew instructions and causing problems with other passengers." Patricia reached over and squeezed Robert's hand. In all their years of marriage, she had never seen him look so helpless. As a successful surgeon, she was used to being respected and treated professionally. This situation felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Kevin tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, what's happening? Are we in trouble?" His 12-year-old mind couldn't understand why the nice airplane lady was suddenly being so mean to them. Lisa had put away her acceptance letter and was staring at her hands. Just minutes ago, she had been the happiest girl in the world, looking forward to starting college and building her future. Now she felt small and ashamed, even though she knew they had done nothing wrong. "It's going to be okay," Patricia whispered to her children, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Within 5 minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the front of the plane. They were both large men in uniform, and their presence immediately made the situation feel more serious and frightening. Other passengers started pulling out their phones, with several beginning to record what was happening. Carol walked quickly to meet the security officers, speaking to them in hushed tones. Robert could see her gesturing toward their family and shaking her head dramatically. Whatever she was telling them, it was clear she was painting them as the problem. The first security officer, a tall man with graying hair, approached their row. "Folks, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said in a professional but firm tone. "What's the problem, officer?" Robert asked, standing up slowly. "We have valid tickets and we haven't done anything wrong." The second security officer, younger and less experienced, looked uncomfortable with the situation. He glanced back and forth between the family and Carol, as if trying to figure out what had really happened. "The flight attendant says you've been disruptive and refusing to follow crew instructions," the older officer explained. "We need to sort this out at the gate." Patricia stood up next to her husband. "Officer, we are not being disruptive. We simply boarded the plane and sat in our assigned seats. We have our boarding passes right here." She held up the tickets, but the officer barely glanced at them. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I need you and your family to gather your belongings and come with us." The humiliation was overwhelming. Other passengers watched as the Johnson family began collecting their carry-on bags from the overhead compartment. Some people were clearly recording the incident, their phones pointed directly at the family. Lisa started to cry quietly, trying to hide her face from the cameras. "This isn't right," said the elderly woman in row 1, finally speaking up. "This family hasn't done anything wrong. I've been watching the whole time." Her husband nodded in agreement. "That flight attendant has been harassing them since they boarded. They're good people," but Carol quickly dismissed their comments. "These passengers don't understand the full situation. I'm trained to recognize problematic behavior before it escalates." The businessman who had been recording stood up. "I've got the whole thing on video. This family has been nothing but polite and respectful. This is completely unfair." Despite the support from other passengers, the security officers seemed determined to remove the Johnson family from the plane. The older officer clearly wanted to resolve the situation quickly and get back to his other duties. "Let's go, folks. We can discuss this at the gate," he said, gesturing toward the front of the plane. Robert felt completely powerless. He was a successful businessman who employed hundreds of people, but in this moment he had no control over what was happening to his family. He picked up their bags and began walking toward the exit, his head held high despite the crushing embarrassment. Patricia followed close behind, holding Kevin's hand tightly. The 12-year-old was now crying, confused and scared by what was happening. He kept looking back at Carol, trying to understand why she was being so mean to his family. Lisa was the last to leave her seat. She looked down at her acceptance, letter one more time before folding it carefully and putting it in her backpack. The joy and pride she had felt that morning seemed like a distant memory now. As they walked through the first-class cabin toward the exit, More passengers began speaking up. A young mother with a baby called out, "This is wrong, you people should be ashamed." A business traveler shook his head and said, "I'm never flying this airline again." But Carol stood firm, convinced that she had handled the situation correctly. She watched the family leave with a satisfied expression, believing she had protected her other passengers from potential problems. The walk down the jet bridge felt endless. Other passengers waiting to board the plane stared at the Johnson family as they were escorted by security officers. Robert could hear people whispering and see them pointing. The shame was almost unbearable. Once they reached the terminal, the security officers led them to a quiet area near the gate. Other travelers in the waiting area turned to look at the commotion, many pulling out their phones to record or take pictures. "Okay, let's sort this out," the older security officer said. "What exactly happened on the plane?" Robert took a deep breath and began explaining the situation from the beginning. He spoke calmly and clearly, describing how they had boarded normally with valid first-class tickets and how the flight attendant had immediately begun questioning their right to be there. Patricia added details about Carol's behavior, explaining how she had been hostile and accusatory from the moment she approached their seats. She emphasized that their children had been well-behaved and quiet throughout the entire ordeal. But when the security officers called Carol to get her side of the story, she painted a completely different picture. She claimed the family had been loud and argumentative, that they had refused to follow her instructions, and that other passengers had complained about their behavior. The younger security officer looked skeptical. "Ma'am, I have to tell you, several passengers on that plane said this family wasn't doing anything wrong. They seemed pretty upset about how you treated them." Carol's face reddened. "Those passengers don't understand airline safety protocols. I was doing my job to maintain order in the cabin." Meanwhile, the videos taken by passengers were already being uploaded to social media. The businessman had posted his recording on Twitter with the caption, "Disgusting treatment of a nice family by Meridian Airways flight attendant. This is what discrimination looks like in 2024. Within an hour, the video had been shared hundreds of times. People were outraged by what they saw, a polite, well-dressed family being humiliated and removed from a plane for no apparent reason other than the flight attendant's prejudice. By evening, the story was trending on multiple social media platforms. News outlets began picking up the story, interviewing passengers who had witnessed the incident. The hashtag #Meridian Airways shame began spreading across the internet. Back at her apartment that night, Carol watched the news coverage with growing unease, but instead of recognizing her mistake, she doubled down on her actions. She called her sister and complained about how passengers these days had no respect for authority, and how social media was making it impossible for flight attendants to do their jobs properly. She had no idea that her actions that day would soon change her life forever. The sun was barely rising when Diana Foster's phone started buzzing nonstop on her nightstand. As the head of crisis management for Meridian Airways, she was used to early morning calls, but this felt different. The urgency in her assistant's voice made her sit up immediately. "Diana, you need to see this right now. There's a video going viral about our flight yesterday, and it's bad. Really bad." Within minutes, Diana was sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open, watching the same video that millions of people had already seen. Her coffee grew cold as she watched the Johnson family being escorted off the plane by security officers. The more she watched, the more her heart sank. The video was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Every social media platform was buzzing with outrage. The hashtag #Meridian Airways discrimination was trending worldwide. News outlets were already calling for interviews, and her phone hadn't stopped ringing. For the past hour, Diana had been in crisis management for 15 years, and she knew a disaster when she saw one. This wasn't just a customer service complaint or a minor incident. This was the kind of story that could destroy a company's reputation overnight. She quickly called CEO Patricia Henley, who was already awake and dealing with the same flood of calls and messages. "Patricia, we have a serious problem," Diana said as soon as the CEO answered. "I know, I've been watching the news for the past 2 hours. Every major network is covering this story. Our stock is already dropping in pre-market trading." Within 3 hours, Meridian Airways headquarters was in full crisis mode. The executive team had assembled in the main conference room, with lawyers, PR specialists, and department heads all trying to figure out how to handle the situation. The video evidence was clear and damaging. Multiple passengers had recorded the incident from different angles, and their stories all matched. The Johnson family had done absolutely nothing wrong. They had been polite, calm, and respectful throughout the entire ordeal. Carol's behavior, on the other hand, looked increasingly indefensible with each viewing. "We need to act fast," Diana told the room. "Every hour we wait, this story gets bigger and more damaging. We're already seeing calls for boycotts, and several corporate clients are questioning their contracts with us." Meanwhile, 50 miles away in his private office, Robert Johnson sat quietly reviewing the flood of messages and interview requests that had been pouring in since the story broke. His assistant had been fielding calls all morning from news networks, talk shows, and advocacy groups wanting to hear his side of the story. Robert's business partner and longtime friend, David Chen, sat across from him shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe this happened to you guys. Patricia and the kids must be devastated." "Lisa hasn't come out of her room since we got home yesterday," Robert said quietly. "She keeps saying she's embarrassed about going to college now, worried that people will recognize her from the video." David leaned forward in his chair. "Robert, you know you could end this whole thing right now, don't you? One phone call to reveal who you really are, and this airline would be begging for forgiveness." Robert had built his technology company from nothing, starting in his garage 20 years ago. Through smart investments and business decisions, he had grown his wealth considerably. Most people didn't know that Johnson Tech Industries was one of the largest shareholders in Meridian Airways, owning a controlling stake in the company through various investment funds. But Robert had always been a private person. He didn't like flaunting his wealth or using his power to get special treatment. He had specifically chosen to fly commercial instead of using the company jet because he wanted his family to have a normal travel experience. "I don't want to make this about money or power," Robert told his friend. "This happened because of something much deeper than that. If I just reveal who I am and make it go away, nothing really changes. The next family that faces this kind of treatment won't have the same options I do." Across town, Dr. Patricia Johnson was dealing with her own flood of interview requests. As a respected surgeon at the city's largest hospital, she was used to handling pressure. But this was different. This was personal, and it involved her children. She had agreed to do one press conference, scheduled for that afternoon. She wanted to speak out not just for her family, but for all the families who had faced similar discrimination without having their stories heard. Patricia spent the morning preparing her statement, thinking carefully about what message she wanted to send. She could have talked about her medical degree, her husband's successful business, or their financial status. Instead, she chose to focus on something more universal. Back at Meridian Airways, the investigation team was working frantically to piece together exactly what had happened. They interviewed the gate agents, reviewed security footage, and spoke with several passengers who had witnessed the incident. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Carol had acted inappropriately, and without justification. The family's boarding passes were legitimate. Their behavior was exemplary, and multiple witnesses confirmed that they had done nothing to warrant removal from the aircraft. The head of Human Resources, Jennifer Martinez, was tasked with reviewing Carol's employment file. What she found was troubling. Over the past 5 years, there had been several complaints about Carol's treatment of passengers, particularly those from minority backgrounds. Each incident had been minor enough to handle, with coaching rather than discipline, but together they painted a concerning pattern. "We should have seen this coming," Jennifer told the CEO during their afternoon meeting. "The signs were all there. We just didn't connect the dots." As the day progressed, the story continued to grow. Celebrity activists began sharing the video and calling for accountability. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the treatment of the Johnson family. Major news networks scheduled primetime segments to discuss the incident. Carol, meanwhile, was at her apartment, growing increasingly frustrated with the media coverage. She had called in sick to work that morning, unable to face her colleagues, after seeing herself on the news. Her phone kept ringing with calls from reporters wanting her side of the story. She spent the day watching the coverage and reading social media comments, becoming more defensive with each passing hour. In her mind, she was being unfairly attacked for doing her job. She convinced herself that people just didn't understand the challenges flight attendants faced every day. "They don't know what it's like up there," she told her roommate, Beth. "You have to make split-second decisions about passenger safety. I thought that family might cause problems, and I was trying to prevent a situation from escalating." Beth had watched the video like everyone else, and she was having a hard time supporting her friend's version of events. "Carol, I've seen the footage. That family wasn't doing anything wrong. The man was reading a magazine, the woman was reading a book, and the kids were just excited about flying. You really think they were a threat?" But Carol wasn't ready to accept responsibility. "The cameras don't show everything. You can't see the attitude, the way they were looking at me, the tension they were creating in the cabin." By evening, Meridian Airways stock had dropped by 12%. Major investors were calling emergency meetings, and several corporate clients had already announced they were reviewing their travel contracts with the airline. The company's board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning. They knew they had to take decisive action, not just to manage the crisis, but to prevent it from happening again. Diana Foster worked late into the night, crafting the company's official response. She knew that whatever they said would be scrutinized by millions of people. One wrong word could make the situation even worse. As she sat in her office, surrounded by drafts of press releases and legal briefs, Diana realized that this incident was about much more than one flight attendant's poor judgment. It was about systemic issues in the airline industry, about unconscious bias, and about the need for real change. The investigation was just beginning, but already it was clear that this story would have consequences that reached far beyond one family's terrible experience on an airplane. The Meridian Airways legal department was working around the clock, preparing for what everyone expected would be a massive lawsuit. The video evidence was damning, and the company's lawyers knew they were facing a difficult battle. Every major law firm in the country was probably reaching out to the Johnson family, offering to represent them in what could become a landmark civil rights case. 26-year-old attorney Jake Morrison had been assigned to research the incident and prepare the company's legal defense. As the newest member of the legal team, he often got the challenging cases that nobody else wanted to handle. This morning, he was sitting in his small office, surrounded by witness statements and legal documents, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his employer. Jake had spent the past 2 days interviewing passengers, reviewing security footage, and building a timeline of events. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Carol had acted improperly, and the Johnson family had legitimate grounds for a discrimination lawsuit. The company would likely have to pay a substantial settlement and face months of negative publicity. As he worked through the legal paperwork, Jake came across the incident report that listed the family's full names and contact information: Robert Johnson, Patricia Johnson, Lisa Johnson, Kevin Johnson. Standard procedure required him to run background checks on all parties involved in potential lawsuits. Jake opened his computer and began searching for information about Robert Johnson. What he found made him stop breathing for a moment. He stared at his screen, reading the same information over and over again, unable to believe what he was seeing. Robert Johnson wasn't just any passenger. He was the founder and CEO of Johnson Tech Industries, one of the most successful technology companies in the country. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was buried deeper in the corporate filings and investment records. Johnson Tech Industries held major stakes in dozens of companies across various industries. Through a network of investment funds and holding companies, Robert Johnson controlled significant portions of airlines, hotels, and other travel-related businesses. And right there, in black and white, was the information that made Jake's hands tremble as he reached for his phone. Johnson Tech Industries owned 67% of Meridian Airways. Robert Johnson wasn't just a passenger who had been wrongfully removed from the plane. He was the majority owner of the entire airline. Carol hadn't just discriminated against a customer. She had humiliated and removed her own boss from his own airplane. Jake stared at his computer screen for several minutes, trying to process what this meant. He had been working for months to impress the senior partners at the law firm, hoping for a promotion. Now he was holding information that would turn the biggest crisis in the company's history completely upside down. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Diana Foster, the head of crisis management. His hands were shaking as he waited for her to answer. "Diana, this is Jake Morrison from Legal. I need to see you immediately. And you might want to call CEO Henley. I've discovered something about the Johnson family that changes everything." 30 minutes later, Jake sat in the executive conference room with Diana Foster, CEO Patricia Henley, and the company's top legal counsel. The atmosphere in the room was tense as Jake explained his discovery. "You're telling me that the passenger we removed from the plane actually owns our airline?" CEO Henley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just owns it," Jake replied. "He controls it. Johnson Tech Industries has a majority stake through various investment vehicles. Technically, Robert Johnson could fire every person in this room if he wanted to." Diana Foster put her head in her hands. As a crisis management professional, she had handled some difficult situations over the years, but nothing quite like this. "Do we know if he's aware that he owns us?" "He has to be," the legal counsel replied. "You don't accidentally own 67% of an airline. He made a deliberate decision not to reveal his identity when this happened." The room fell silent, as everyone tried to process the implications. Robert Johnson could have ended the entire crisis with a single phone call. He could have told Carol exactly who she was dealing with, and the situation would have been resolved immediately. Instead, he had chosen to let events play out naturally, allowing his family to be humiliated and the company to face a potential disaster. Why would he do that? Diana wondered aloud. Why would he let this crisis spiral out of control when he could have stopped it? CEO Henley was already thinking several steps ahead. "Because he wants to see how we handle it. He's testing us. He wants to know if we'll do the right thing when we think nobody important is watching." The realization was both terrifying and enlightening. For the past 3 days, the entire company had been scrambling to manage a crisis involving one of their most powerful stakeholders. Every decision they made, every statement they released, every action they took was being evaluated by the man who controlled their company's future. Meanwhile, at Meridian Airways' Employee Relations Department, Carol had been called in for what she thought was a routine meeting about the incident. She sat in the waiting area, checking her phone and reading the latest news coverage about her confrontation with the Johnson family. Carol still believed she had done nothing wrong. In her mind, she was being unfairly targeted by social media and the news media for simply doing her job. She had spent the past few days giving interviews to sympathetic talk radio hosts who supported her version of events. "Flight attendants have to make tough decisions every day," she had told one radio host. "We can't second-guess ourselves when passenger safety is at stake." That family was creating a disturbance, and I handled it appropriately. The employee relations manager, Michelle Torres, called Carol into her office. Michelle had been dreading this meeting all morning. She had worked with Carol for several years and had always found her to be a dedicated employee, even if she could be difficult at times. "Carol, thank you for coming in today. I know this has been a challenging week for you." Carol sat down across from Michelle's desk, her posture defensive. "It has been challenging, but I stand by my actions. I was protecting the other passengers and maintaining order in the cabin." Michelle opened the file on her desk, which contained witness statements, security footage analysis, and the results of the internal investigation. "Carol, I need to be direct with you. Our investigation has concluded that your actions were inappropriate and violated company policy regarding passenger treatment." "That's ridiculous," Carol replied immediately. "I followed proper procedure. That family was being disruptive and refusing to cooperate." "Carol, we have video evidence and testimony from multiple passengers that contradicts your account. The family was calm and cooperative throughout the entire incident. There was no justification for removing them from the aircraft." But Carol wasn't ready to accept responsibility. "Those passengers don't understand what they saw. They don't know how to recognize problematic behavior before it escalates. I do. I've been doing this job for 15 years. Michelle took a deep breath. She still hadn't revealed the most important piece of information, that the family Carol had removed actually owned the airline. The executive team had decided to see if Carol would accept responsibility for her actions before dropping that bombshell. Carol, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to explain your actions. Is there anything you want to change about your account of what happened? Carol leaned forward in her chair, her voice growing more defensive. I don't need to change anything. I saw a potential problem and I acted to prevent it from getting worse. If this company doesn't support flight attendants who are trying to maintain safety and order, then maybe I don't want to work here anymore. Michelle realized that Carol was never going to admit her mistake. Despite overwhelming evidence, multiple witness accounts, and clear video footage, she remained convinced that she had acted appropriately. Carol, there's something else you need to know about this situation, Michelle said slowly. Something that makes your actions even more serious than we initially realized. Carol looked confused. What do you mean? Michelle opened another folder on her desk. The Johnson family that you removed from the aircraft, Robert Johnson specifically, he's not just any passenger. He's the owner of this airline. The color drained from Carol's face. She stared at Michelle in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without making any sound. For the first time since the incident occurred, she looked genuinely shocked and afraid. That's impossible, she whispered. He can't be the owner. He would have said something. He would have told me who he was. He chose not to reveal his identity, Michelle explained. He wanted to see how his employees would treat a regular passenger. And now he knows. Carol sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed since Michelle Torres had delivered the shocking news. The woman she had humiliated and removed from the airplane, along with his entire family, owned the Aoi company she worked for. Every paycheck she had received for the past 15 years had ultimately come from Robert Johnson. I need to call him, Carol whispered, her voice shaking. I need to apologize. Maybe if I explain that I was just trying to do my job. Michelle shook her head gently. Carol, I'm afraid it's too late for that. The executive board met this morning and they've made their decision. Your employment with Meridian Airways is terminated, effective immediately. The words hit Carol like a physical blow. She had worked for this airline for 15 years, building her entire career and identity around being a flight attendant. The job wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. And now, because of one incident that she still believed was justified, everything was being taken away from her. You can't do this to me, Carol protested, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. I have rights, I have a union, I was protecting the passengers. Carol, the evidence is overwhelming. We have video footage, witness statements, and a clear pattern of inappropriate behavior toward passengers. The union has already reviewed the case and declined to fight the termination. As Carol was escorted from the building with her personal belongings in a cardboard box, reporters were already gathering outside Meridian Airways headquarters. Word had leaked about Robert Johnson's ownership of the airline, and the media was preparing for what promised to be one of the most dramatic press conferences in corporate history. Inside the executive boardroom, Robert Johnson sat at the head of the table for the first time since the crisis began. He had arrived that morning dressed in a simple business suit, looking every bit the successful CEO he was, but also like the father and husband who had been deeply hurt by the events of the past week. CEO Patricia Henley, who had been running the company day to day, sat to his right. She had submitted her resignation that morning, though Robert had not yet decided whether to accept it. The entire crisis had happened under her leadership, and she felt personally responsible for the culture that had allowed such discrimination to occur. Before we discuss the company's public response, Robert began, his voice calm but firm, I want each of you to understand something. What happened to my family last week wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of systemic problems that we've allowed to fester in this company for years. He gestured to a thick folder on the table. I've spent the past 3 days reviewing employee complaints, passenger feedback, and incident reports. Carol's behavior toward my family wasn't unusual. It was just the first time it happened to someone who had the power to make it public. The room was silent as the executives absorbed this information. Diana Foster, The crisis management director had suspected as much, but seeing the evidence laid out was still shocking. "We failed our passengers and we failed our employees," Robert continued. "We've created a work environment where discrimination is tolerated, where complaints are ignored, and where people like Carol feel empowered to treat passengers badly based on their own biases." David Chen, Robert's longtime business partner and friend, had flown in that morning to support him through the press conference. He watched as Robert struggled with the emotions of the past week, the anger at how his family had been treated, the disappointment in the company he had invested in, and the determination to create something positive from this terrible experience. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, reporters packed into the main conference room at Meridian Airways headquarters. Camera crews from every major news network were present, along with journalists from newspapers, magazines, and online publications. The story had captured national attention, and everyone wanted to hear what Robert Johnson would say. Robert walked to the podium with Dr. Patricia Johnson by his side. Lisa and Kevin had chosen to stay home, still dealing with the emotional aftermath of their public humiliation. Lisa had been particularly affected, worried that the incident would follow her to college and impact how people saw her. "Good afternoon," Robert began, his voice steady despite the dozens of cameras pointed at him. "My name is Robert Johnson, and I'm here today not just as the owner of Meridian Airways, but as a father and husband whose family was subjected to inexcusable discrimination." He paused, looking out at the room full of reporters. "For the past week, people have been asking why I didn't immediately reveal my identity when this incident occurred. Why did I allow my family to be humiliated? Why did I let this crisis spiral out of control when I could have stopped it with a phone call?" The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on his words. "I let it happen because I wanted to see how this company would respond when they thought nobody important was watching. I wanted to know if they would do the right thing for a regular family, not just for someone with money and power." Robert's voice grew stronger as he continued. "What I discovered was deeply troubling. The discrimination my family faced wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that this company has tolerated for too long." He announced that Carol had been terminated but emphasized that she was not the only problem. "Firing one employee is not enough. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place." Robert then revealed his plan for change. Meridian Airways would invest $50 million in a comprehensive bias training program, not just for their own employees but for the entire airline industry. They would establish an independent oversight committee to investigate discrimination complaints, and they would create scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation. "My daughter Lisa was accepted to one of the country's top universities," Robert said, his voice filled with pride despite everything that had happened. "She was supposed to be celebrating that achievement last week. Instead, she spent the flight home in tears, wondering if she really belonged in the places she had worked so hard to reach." Dr. Patricia Johnson stepped forward to speak. "As a surgeon, I've dedicated my life to helping people regardless of their background, race, or economic status. But last week I couldn't protect my own children from the harm caused by prejudice and discrimination." She announced the creation of the Dignity in Transit Foundation, which would work with transportation companies across the country to develop better policies and training programs to prevent discrimination. The questions from reporters were intense, but Robert answered each one thoughtfully. When asked if he planned to sue the airline he owned, he smiled slightly. "It's hard to sue yourself. Instead, I'm going to fix the problems that led to this situation." 6 months later, the changes at Meridian Airways were already visible. The company had implemented the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in the airline industry. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement, and customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped dramatically. Carol had struggled to find work in the airline industry after her termination. The video of her confronting the Johnson family had made her recognizable, and other airlines were reluctant to hire someone associated with such a high-profile discrimination incident. She eventually found work in a different field and began attending counseling sessions to address her unconscious biases. Lisa Johnson thrived at university, becoming a leader in student organizations focused on civil rights and social justice. She often spoke about her family's experience, using it as motivation to fight for others who faced similar discrimination. The incident that had once embarrassed her became a source of strength and purpose. Kevin, now 13, had become something of a celebrity at his middle school. His classmates were impressed that his father owned an airline, but Kevin was more proud of the changes his family had helped create. On a sunny Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after the incident, the Johnson family boarded a Meridian Airways flight for the first time since that terrible day. The crew, which had been specially trained in the new customer service protocols, welcomed them warmly and professionally. As the plane took off, Robert looked out the window and reflected on how much had changed. One flight attendant's prejudice had nearly destroyed his family's faith in humanity, but it had also given them the opportunity to create meaningful change for thousands of other travelers. The story of Flight 447 became a case study in business, schools, and civil rights training programs, showing how one family's terrible experience could be transformed into a force for positive change throughout an entire industry.